نريد لبنان ملتقى وفاق عربي.
Good afternoon. You're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Yumna Nofa. These are today's top stories. The Canadian Foreign Minister meets with President Michel Aoun as part of a 4-day visit to Lebanon. Syrian government forces gain more ground in the battle for Aleppo as the UN Security Council prepares to vote on a resolution demanding a ceasefire in the battered city. And Western-backed Iraqi forces begin shelling parts of West Mosul, preparing to open a new front against ISIS. The Canadian Foreign Minister met with President Michel Aoun as part of a 4-day visit to Lebanon. Canadian Foreign Minister Stéphane Dion headed to the Babda Palace earlier this morning to congratulate Aoun on his election as Lebanon's 13th president, ending more than 2 years without a head of state. During their meeting, Aoun and Dion discussed the refugee crisis and means to aid Lebanon. The Lebanese president emphasized the need to find a political solution to the crisis in Syria, which would have a positive impact on the refugee crisis. The two also touched on improving bilateral ties between the two countries. Lebanon's economy and infrastructure has been heavily impacted by the onset of the Syrian conflict and resulting influx of refugees. Dion later headed to caretaker Prime Minister Tamam Salam's residence in Beirut's Musaid area, where the two officials discussed recent developments in Lebanon and the region as well. After a late armed attack against an infantry brigade in North Lebanon killed a soldier, the Lebanese army staged raids earlier this morning in the northern district of Diniye in search for the assailants. Media outlets are reporting that one soldier named Amin Mustafa al-Muhammad was killed and another was injured overnight. One gunman attacked the 10th Infantry Brigade in the northern town of Ab'a Safrin. The army staged raids this morning after the aggression against the troops. A security source told LBC that the army had not staged raids before the assault on the army. Syrian government forces gain more ground in the battle for Aleppo as the UN Security Council prepares to vote on a resolution demanding a ceasefire in the battered city. The army and allied forces seized the Qadi Askar neighborhood overnight and 3 weeks into their offensive to retake the rebel-held east of Aleppo, which was in control of around 2/3 of former rebel territory. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which relies mostly on witnesses on the ground, said the latest advances had left the large Shah neighborhood effectively encircled by government forces. The observatory director, Rami Abdurrahman, says the army was attacking both from inside East Aleppo and from government-held western districts. Its loss would mark the biggest defeat in rebel forces in Syria's 5-year civil war, almost 6 years this coming March. Terrified residents spent a sleepless night in rebel-held neighborhoods as dozens of rockets rained down. And on to neighboring Iraq, where Western-backed Iraqi forces have begun shelling parts of West Mosul. Residents are saying preparing to open a new front against ISIS 7 weeks into a tortuous campaign to drive the militants from the city. Federal police forces stationed a few miles, that's a few more kilometers, outside and south of Mosul on the west bank of the Tigris River that divides the city. And they have long said they aim to advance towards the airport on the southwestern edge. Military commanders hope that by opening a second front within the city, they can increase pressure on the few thousand extremists who have deployed suicide bombers, snipers, and militant cells against elite Iraqi troops in eastern districts. Some 100,000 Iraqi soldiers, security forces, Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, and mainly Shia paramilitary forces are participating in the assault that began on October 17th with air and ground support from a U.S.-led international military coalition. Coming up next, more headlines as we return. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching the Future News here at 1620. The expected resignation of Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi marks the start of a new period of uncertainty in Italian politics. It will be the job of President Sergio Mattarella to decide what happens next. And here are some of his options. Renzi stays in power. Renzi, after a final meeting of his cabinet, will on Monday visit Mattarella, who could ask him to form a new government. Theoretically, he could win a vote of confidence in Parliament, either with his current majority or with this new one, including Silvio Berlusconi's centre-right Forza Italia. But during a press conference earlier this morning, Renzi seemed to exclude this possibility. He was quoted saying, "My experience of government finishes here." The crushing victory for the no camp, which is thought to have scored almost 60% of the vote, makes the return of Renzi a very distant possibility. Nominating a technocratic government, that would probably be the most likely scenario. Mattarella appoints the head of government with the support of the current majority of a new enlarged majority. And on to England, where Prime Minister Theresa May's government launched a challenge against a court ruling that it requires parliamentary approval to start the process of leaving the European Union, a decision that could upset Britain's Brexit plans. If the Supreme Court, the United Kingdom's highest judicial body, dismisses the government appeal, it could derail May's timetable for triggering Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty and leaving the European Union. The government's legal fight comes against a backdrop of claims by some politicians and newspapers that establishment judges want to thwart the Brexit process. It will be the most high-profile and complex case the court has considered since it came into being 7 years ago and is due to last 4 days. For the first time, all its 11 justices will sit on the panel with the verdict due later in January. If May wins, she can proceed with her plans to invoke Article 50 by the end of March. President-elect Donald Trump announced he has nominated Ben Carson, the retired neurosurgeon who challenged him for the Republican nomination, to be Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Ben Carson, he said, has a brilliant mind and is passionate about strengthening communities and families within those communities. Trump also added that they talked at length about his urban renewal agenda and the message of economic revival, very much including their inner cities.
I've come to know Donald Trump over the last few years. He is actually a very intelligent man who cares deeply about America. There are two different Donald Trumps. There's the one you see on the stage, and there's the one who's very cerebral, sits there and considers things very carefully. You can have a very good conversation with him. And that's the Donald Trump that you're going to start seeing more and more of right now.
The death toll in a fire that devastated a California loft building during a weekend dance party has climbed to 36 people and will likely rise further as recovery teams push deeper into the charred ruin, authorities are saying. This happened in Oakland. Oakland firefighters found the remains of 30 victims as they sifted through the debris-filled shell of the two-story converted warehouse being used by an artists' collective. The cause of the fire is still undetermined, officials are saying, but they asked family members to preserve items that might contain DNA of the victims, including combs, toothbrushes, hairbrushes, to help with identification. Only 20% of the building had been searched in the past 12 hours, according to Melinda Drayton, the battalion chief at the Oakland Fire Department. The recovery operation had been delayed for hours until workers could enter safely. The roof that collapsed onto the second floor and in some spots is the second story, and it had fallen onto the first. On that note, we end our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our headlines. Canadian Foreign Minister meets with President Michel Aoun as part of a 4-day visit to Lebanon. Syrian government forces gain more ground in the battle for Aleppo as the UN Security Council prepares to vote on a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire. And Western-backed Iraqi forces begin shelling parts of Mosul, preparing to open a new front against ISIS. Yumna Nawfal wishing you all a great week ahead. Signing off. Take care.
نريد لبنان ملتقى وفاق عربي